My name is Mary and I'm 35 years old. I'm a trauma surgeon, which means I'm trained to walk into blood, panic, broken bones, screaming families, and still know exactly what must be done first. But nothing in an operating room prepared me for the sound I heard when I came home early that afternoon. My daughter was sobbing inside my own house, the kind of terrified cry that makes a mother stop breathing before she even understands why. I pushed the front door open wider and froze just long enough to see the truth. My father was in my living room yelling threats at a child while my older sister was tearing through my bedroom like a thief who already believed she deserved everything she touched. Drawers were open. My mother's old jewelry box was missing from the dresser. Papers from my file cabinet were scattered across the hallway. Someone had searched for the deed, the apartment documents, and the blue folder I kept locked away for a reason. For 1 second, the surgeon in me tried to triage the scene. Child first, exit second, threat, evidence fourth. The mother in me wanted to run straight at them. Instead, I stepped back into the shadow beside the hallway, pulled out my phone, and dialed 911 without making a sound. When the operator answered, I whispered, "My family broke into my house. They're threatening my daughter. Send police now." Before I tell you what they were really searching for, and why the sirens outside ruined far more than their afternoon, tell me, what time is it for you right now? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like where you are? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The operator told me to stay on the line, and I did. Even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to rush into that room, my daughter Emma was only 8 years old. She was brave in the way children try to be brave when adults terrify them, silent, stiff, trying not to make things worse. My father, Charles, stood over her with one hand braced on the wall, blocking the hallway as if my home belonged to him. My older sister Rachel was in my bedroom dumping dresser drawers onto the floor and muttering curses under her breath. I heard the wooden scrape of my nightstand hitting the wall, then the sharp crack of something fragile breaking. "Tell me where your mother keeps the blue folder," Charles snapped. "Don't act stupid. You've seen it." Emma cried harder. "I don't know." "She's lying," Rachel called from my room. "Mary always hides things. Jewelry, contracts, bank papers. She thinks she's better than us." My hand tightened around the phone. I was still half hidden behind the hallway corner, and the operator could hear enough to understand I was not exaggerating. In the operating room, panic kills people faster than injury. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I checked Charles's hands. No weapon. I checked Emma's distance from him. Too close. I checked Rachel's bag on my bed, heavy, open. My mother's pearl necklace was already inside it. That necklace had been left to me in my mother's will, along with a small share in an apartment building she had quietly invested in years before she died. Charles had always called it family property, even though the paperwork said otherwise. Rachel had always called it unfair, even though she had received her own inheritance and burned through it within 3 years. I had helped them more times than I wanted to admit. I paid Charles's property taxes once when he said he was about to lose his land. I gave Rachel money for a divorce attorney when she swore she would pay me back. I covered medical bills, car repairs, hotel stays, emergency loans that were never emergencies after the check cleared. I even missed Emma's school recital once because Charles called me in tears, saying the bank was about to take everything, only for me to learn later he had used part of the money on a hunting trip. Each time I told myself love meant patience. Each time they learned my guilt had a dollar amount. But I never signed over my house. I never signed over my apartment shares. I never gave them access to the trust one had created for Emma. And now I understood why they had waited until my hospital schedule said I would be gone until evening. They did not come to ask. They came to corner my child, steal what they could, and force me to surrender the rest. Charles lowered his voice, but that made it worse. "Listen to me, little girl. Your mother is selfish. If she loved this family, she would help us. If she doesn't sign those papers, people are going to lose everything." Emma whispered, "Please don't yell." That was the moment something inside me went completely still, not calm, not peaceful, surgical, precise. I had seen families collapse in waiting rooms when fear made them cruel. But this was not fear. This was a plan. Rachel came out of my bedroom holding a stack of documents. Found copies of the apartment agreement, but not the transfer certificate. She must have moved it. Charles cursed. Then we make her sign new ones. Rachel laughed, bitter and breathless. You think she'll sign after this? She will if she wants her daughter to stop being scared. The operator's voice came quietly through my phone. Officers are on the way. Are you safe? I whispered, not yet. Then I lifted the phone just enough to keep recording and stepped closer to the living room entrance. I could see the whole room now, my daughter trapped beside the bookshelf, my father pacing like a man rehearsing a threat, my sister holding papers that represented years of my work. For the first time, I did not ask myself how they could do this to me. I asked myself what kind of mother I would be if I let them do it to Emma, too. When I stepped into the living room, Emma saw me first. Her face changed so fast it nearly broke me. Hope, shame, fear, relief, all of it flashed across her eyes before she tried to stand. Charles spun around. Mary, he barked, as if I was the intruder. Rachel appeared behind him with my mother's necklace in one hand and my property folder in the other. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then I said, Emma, come to me. Charles shifted like he wanted to block her, and I raised my phone. Don't. He looked at the phone, then at my face. Are you recording us? Yes. Rachel's expression twisted. You psycho. You're recording your own family? No, I said, I'm recording 2 adults who broke into my house, stole jewelry, threatened my daughter, and searched for legal documents they had no right to touch. Charles took 1 step toward me. Careful how you talk to your father. The sentence might have worked on me 10 years earlier, maybe even 5. Back then, I still believed respect meant obedience. I still believed helping family meant bleeding quietly so they could call it love. But when I saw Emma hiding behind my leg, shaking so hard her fingers dug into my scrubs, every old rule died. You are not in charge here, I said. This is my house. Those are my documents. That is my child. Rachel threw the folder onto the coffee table. Paper slid across the glass. Your house. Your documents. Your child. That's always the problem with you. Everything is yours. Because I worked for it. Charles laughed, but his face had gone pale around the mouth. You think being a doctor makes you untouchable? We made sacrifices for you. You made loans out of my guilt, I said. And I paid them until I finally learned the difference between helping and being hunted. Rachel's eyes flickered. She had not expected that, neither had Charles. For years, I had answered their insults with explanations. I had defended my schedule, defended my savings, defended why I could not keep paying for emergencies that never ended. But that day, standing between my daughter and the people who had taught me to fear disappointing them, I felt no need to explain my life. I looked at the folder on the table and saw exactly what they had found: apartment records, insurance papers, old tax copies, and a blank transfer form I had kept only because my attorney had told me never to throw away anything connected to the estate. But something else was missing. My spare key. The one that had been hidden in the kitchen drawer was gone. How did you get in? I asked. Charles crossed his arms. Don't start. How did you get into my locked house? Rachel's lips pressed together. I looked at her bag. You took my spare key when you came over for Emma's birthday. She snapped, that's not the point. It is now. Charles slammed his hand on the coffee table so hard Emma flinched. My arm went around her immediately. Sign the papers, he growled. Rachel's lender needs collateral, and my land is already tied up. If you transfer your apartment share temporarily, we can fix everything. Temporarily, I repeated. Is that what you call forging my name? His eyes narrowed. Rachel said too quickly, nobody forged anything. I turned my phone so they could see the active call timer. Police are coming. For the first time, silence hit the room. Outside, faint but growing, sirens began to cut through the Montana air. Charles's face changed from rage to calculation. Mary, listen to me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you overreacted. Rachel stepped closer, suddenly softer, suddenly desperate. Please, you don't understand what this will do to us. I almost asked what terrifying a child would do to Emma, but I already knew they would not care until the consequences reached their own doorstep. You still think this is about what happens to you? I said. Charles lowered his voice. You are making a mistake you can't undo. I looked at my daughter, then at my sister's bag, then at my father standing in the center of the home I had built after years of double shifts and grief. No, I said, for once I'm going to tell the truth. The siren stopped so close that the windows trembled. Charles moved first, not toward the door, but toward me. He reached for my wrist, and I stepped back just as the front door opened behind him. 2 officers entered with the kind of calm authority that makes guilty people suddenly remember manners. Police, one of them called. Everyone stay where you are. Charles released the space between us like it had burned him. Rachel shoved my mother's necklace deeper into her bag, but one officer saw it. I saw him see it. That tiny movement became the first crack in their performance. Officers, Charles said, lifting both hands in a wounded, fatherly gesture. This is a family disagreement. My daughter is tired from work. She's emotional. I almost laughed. Emotional? That was always the word men like him used when a woman stopped obeying. Officer Williams looked at me. Ma'am, are you the caller? Yes, my name is Mary. This is my home. My father and sister entered without permission, searched my bedroom, stole jewelry, threatened my daughter, and tried to pressure me into signing property documents. Rachel exploded. That is a lie. Emma pressed her face into my side. I kept one hand on her shoulder and held out my phone with the other. The 911 call is still connected. I also recorded the last several minutes. Charles's eyes turned cold. Mary, one word, a warning. Officer Williams stepped between us. Sir, do not speak to her right now. The second officer, Thompson, asked Rachel to put her bag on the floor. She refused. He asked again. Her hand shook as she dropped it. When he opened it, the living room went silent in a way I will never forget. My mother's pearl necklace, 2 rings, my spare key, a folded transfer form, and a notary stamp that did not belong to anyone in my house. Several pages with my name already typed into signature lines. Officer Thompson's jaw tightened. Whose documents are these? Rachel looked at Charles. Charles looked at the floor. That was all the answer anyone needed. The officer separated us. Emma and I were moved toward the kitchen while Rachel started crying, but not from guilt, from being caught. Charles tried a different mask. I'm a grandfather, he said. I was trying to protect my family from financial ruin. Officer Williams replied, by threatening a child. Charles's face hardened. You don't understand our situation. I understand what I heard on the call, the officer said. And I understand what is in that bag. Rachel shouted, Mary set us up. That sentence almost made me smile because the truth was so much better. I hadn't set them up. I had simply stopped covering for them. My house had cameras because Rachel had once borrowed a bracelet and insisted I must have misplaced it. My locks had logs because Charles had a habit of showing up when I was at work. My attorney had digital copies because people who demand trust the loudest are often the reason you need records. Officer Thompson asked Emma if she was hurt. She shook her head but whispered, he said Mom would lose the house if I didn't tell. That was the sentence that ended Charles's performance. The officers cuffed him first. He fought it with words, not fists, which somehow made him look smaller. Mary, you're going to destroy this family. I looked at him as the metal clicked around his wrists. No, I'm protecting what's left of it. Rachel screamed when they cuffed her, claiming the jewelry was family jewelry, claiming the papers were just copies, claiming Emma was dramatic. But the neighbors had stepped onto their porches by then. The woman across the road, who had brought casseroles after my mother died, watched Rachel being led outside with my mother's necklace sealed in an evidence bag. Charles saw the neighbors. That was when his face finally changed. Not regret, humiliation. And for people like him, humiliation hurts more than guilt ever could. As the patrol cars pulled away, Officer Thompson stayed behind and asked if we had somewhere safe to stay that night. I looked around my own living room at the drawers emptied onto the floor, the broken picture frame, the coffee table covered in papers, and realized safety is not just a locked door. Safety is knowing the people outside that door respect your right to keep it closed. "We'll be okay," I said, though my voice sounded older than it had that morning. He handed me a card. "Dr. Mary, this may be more than trespassing. A detective will need to speak with you." I nodded, still holding Emma. I thought the worst part was over. I was wrong. What they had done inside my house was only the surface. The real theft had started months earlier, hidden inside a forgotten envelope that Rachel thought she had already destroyed. The silence that followed the departure of the patrol cars was heavier than the noise of the sirens. It was the kind of silence I usually felt in the operating room right after a patient stabilized, a thick, ringing quiet that signaled the immediate danger had passed, but the real work was just beginning. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. That was the surgeon in me. But my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. That was the mother. Emma was still clinging to my leg, her small frame trembling. I picked her up, carrying her to the sofa, stepping over the scattered remains of my life. My mother's jewelry box sat empty on the floor. My medical journals were tossed aside like trash. But as I began to gather the papers strewn across the rug, I saw it. It was a plain, manila envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges, tucked inside the back cover of an old childhood photo album that Rachel had thrown against the wall in her rage. Rachel must have missed it. She had been so focused on the blue folder, the obvious target, that she hadn't realized my mother had hidden the real truth in plain sight. I sat on the floor, the weight of the envelope in my lap feeling like a lead brick. I didn't open it immediately. I couldn't. Instead, I spent the next hour focused on Emma. I made her hot chocolate, tucked her into my bed, and promised her that the bad feelings were leaving the house for good. Once she finally fell into a fitful sleep, I returned to the living room. I sat at the kitchen table, the light from the overhead lamp casting long shadows. I pulled the tab on the envelope. Inside wasn't just a document, it was a ledger of betrayal. There were bank statements from 3 years ago, during the final 6 months of my mother's life. Back then, I was doing my residency, working 80-hour weeks, exhausted and grieving. I had trusted Charles to handle Mom's medical bills. I had trusted Rachel to help with the house, but the statements showed a different story. Large sums of money meant for my mother's specialized oncology treatments, had been diverted. $20,000 here. $15,000 there. The destination? A private account in Rachel's name. And the signatures on the withdrawal slips weren't my mother's shaky, weakened script. They were a near-perfect imitation. But they weren't Rachel's either. They were Charles's. My own father had been forged his dying wife's name to fund my sister's failing business ventures and his own gambling debts while I was at the hospital trying to save strangers. I felt a coldness wash over me that no surgical scrub-in could match. This wasn't just a break-in. This was a long-term heist. The blue folder they had been looking for today wasn't just about the apartment shares, it contained the final audit my mother must have started before she passed. She knew. She had found out they were stealing from her, and she had hidden the evidence where she thought they would never look. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Kevin, my lawyer, and one of the few people who knew the full extent of the family's history. "Mary, I just heard from the precinct," Kevin said, his voice tight. "Harris called me. They processed Charles and Rachel. But Mary, there's a complication. Rachel is already claiming that the necklace and the papers were given to her by your mother before she died. She's playing the misunderstood heir card. She's lying, Kevin, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a long distance. And I have the proof. I found the envelope. The one Rachel was looking for. What's in it? Evidence of embezzlement. Forgery. They didn't just try to take my house today, Kevin. They drained Mom's medical fund while she was still in the hospice. They literally stole the time she had left. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. If you have proof of that, this stops being a simple burglary. This becomes a felony fraud case with years of evidence. But you need to be careful. People like Charles don't go down without trying to burn the whole house down. He already tried, I said, looking at the door. He used Emma. There's no coming back from that. The next morning, the reality of the situation hit the local gossip mill. In a small town, a trauma surgeon's father and sister being hauled away in handcuffs is front-page news. My phone was a minefield of "Are you okay?" texts and "How could you do this to your own blood?" messages from distant relatives who hadn't seen my mother in a decade. I ignored them all. I had a shift at the hospital, and in my world, a distracted surgeon is a dangerous one. I walked into the trauma center at 7 a.m., my face a mask of professional neutrality. I spent 12 hours repairing a shattered femur, stopping a splenic bleed, and stitching a teenager back together after a car wreck. Every time I held a scalpel, I thought about the precision required to cut something out before it kills the host. That was what I was doing with my family. When I finished my shift, Detective Harris was waiting for me in the surgical lounge. She looked tired, her badge clipped to a belt over a wrinkled blazer. "Dr. Mary," she said, nodding toward a chair. "We spent the morning going through the items recovered from your sister's bag. We found something your father was trying to hide in his pocket during the arrest." She slid a clear plastic evidence bag across the table. Inside was a small, ornate key. "It wasn't to my house. Do you recognize this?" Harris asked. "It looks like a safe deposit box key," I said. "But my mother's box was closed 3 years ago. I handled the estate." "That's what we thought," Harris replied. "But this key belongs to a private vault in the city. It's registered to C&R Associates, a business your father and sister formed 2 months before your mother passed. We have reason to believe that some of the physical assets, the ones that went missing during the probate of the will, might be in there. The betrayal had layers, like a tumor with deep, invasive roots. While I was mourning, they were forming shell companies." "I have more for you, detective," I said. I pulled out the copies of the bank statements I had made that morning. "This is the why behind the break-in. They weren't just looking for property deeds. They were looking for the trail of the money they stole from my mother's treatments." Harris scanned the documents, her jaw tightening. "This changes the charges. This isn't just trespassing. This is a predatory financial crime. I'm going to need the originals, and I'm going to need a statement regarding the notary stamp we found in the bag." "The notary stamp?" I asked, confused. "I don't own one." "Exactly," Harris said. "It's a forged stamp in the name of a woman who died 5 years ago. They were planning to notarize your signature on those transfer papers themselves. They were going to steal your portion of the apartment complex and sell it before you even knew the papers existed." I felt a wave of nausea. They hadn't just come to pressure me. They had come to erase my legal standing entirely. That evening, as I was picking Emma up from my friend's house, my phone rang again. It was a collect call from the county jail. I should have declined it. I should have blocked the number. But I needed to hear the tone of his voice. I needed to know if there was even a shred of the father I remembered left inside the man who had terrified my daughter. I accepted the call. "Mary," Charles's voice crackled through the line. He didn't sound repentant. He sounded indignant. "You've had your fun. You've made your point. Now call that lawyer of yours and tell the police you want to drop the charges. This is embarrassing for the family." "Embarrassing?" I whispered, standing in the driveway, watching Emma play with a golden retriever in the yard. "You stood over your granddaughter and threatened her, Dad." You broke into my home. You stole Mom's jewelry. That jewelry belongs to the family, he barked. And Rachel was just trying to fix the mess you made by being so stingy with the inheritance. You have a surgeon's salary, Mary. You don't need that apartment building. We do. I raised you. I paid for your school. You didn't pay for my school, Dad. I had a full scholarship and 3 jobs. You took out a loan in my name that I spent 5 years paying back. I'm done being your ATM. If you don't drop this, Charles said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss, I'll tell everyone what really happened at the hospital. I'll tell the board about your instability. Don't think I don't know people, Mary. Are you threatening my career now? I asked, a cold smile touching my lips. Go ahead. Tell them. But while you're doing that, the police are looking into C and our associates. They have the key, Dad. They have the bank statements from Mom's medical fund. The silence on the other end was absolute. For the first time in my life, I had rendered my father speechless. You found it, he finally whispered. I found everything, I said. And I'm not dropping anything. In fact, I'm adding to it. Goodbye, Charles. I hung up and felt a weight lift off my shoulders, replaced by a crystalline clarity. The forgotten envelope had done more than just provide evidence, it had provided permission. Permission to stop being the good daughter to people who had never been a good family. But as I drove Emma home, I noticed a black SUV parked 2 houses down from mine. It wasn't a neighbor's car. When I pulled into my driveway, the SUV's lights flickered once, then it drove away slowly. I realized then that Rachel and Charles weren't the only ones who wanted that blue folder. Rachel's debts didn't just come from bad business, she had been borrowing from people who didn't use lawyers to collect. And by sending my sister to jail, I might have just inherited her creditors. I walked into my house, locked the new deadbolt, and looked at the blue folder sitting on the counter. The real theft wasn't just about money. It was about the secrets my mother had died trying to protect me from, secrets that were now my responsibility to bury for good. I opened the folder one more time, looking past the property deeds, down to the very last page. There was a handwritten note from my mother, dated the day before she went into the hospital for the last time. It read, Mary, if you are reading this, it means they finally pushed you too far. Don't look back. The apartment isn't just an investment. Look at the foundation records. The basement isn't empty. My breath hitched. I lived 3 blocks away from that apartment building. I had managed it for 3 years, but I had never gone into the sub-basement. I thought it was just old storage and boiler pipes. I grabbed my coat. I needed to know what my mother had been hiding, not just from them, but from me. Because in a family of thieves, even the victim might be holding a smoking gun. The drive to the apartment building was only 3 blocks, but it felt like a journey across a border into a country I no longer recognized. Every time I checked my rearview mirror, I expected to see those black SUV headlights cutting through the dark, a silent reminder that my sister's mistakes had teeth, and those teeth were now bared at me. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my surgical scars ached. I was Mary, the woman who handled arterial sprays and shattered femurs without blinking, yet here I was, trembling because of a blue folder and a mother's cryptic warning. The apartment building, a brick mid-rise I had spent 3 years maintaining with my own salary, stood like a silent witness on the corner of 4th and Elm. I pulled into the narrow alleyway, killed the engine, and sat in the darkness for a moment. My mother's note echoed in my head, the basement isn't empty. I had been in the basement 100 times to check the boiler or talk to the super, but the sub-basement, the crawl space beneath the foundation, was something I had always assumed was just dirt and structural support. I stepped out of the car, the cold Montana air biting at my neck. I didn't call Kevin yet. I didn't call Detective Harris. If I was about to find something that changed everything, I needed to see it with my own eyes first. I unlocked the side entrance, the heavy iron door groaning on its hinges. The hallway smelled of floor wax and old radiator steam. I moved past the tenant mailboxes, down the stairs, past the laundry room, until I reached the heavy wooden door marked, maintenance only. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and rust. I switched on my professional-grade penlight, the beam cutting a sharp circle through the gloom. I moved to the far corner, behind the oversized boiler unit, where the foundation wall met the floor. There was a hatch, rusted and nearly invisible under a layer of discarded plywood. I cleared the debris, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I pulled the hatch open, a gust of stale, frozen air rushed up to meet me. I climbed down the short ladder into a space no higher than 5 feet. This wasn't just a crawl space. It was a reinforced room, built into the very bones of the building. And sitting in the center, on a raised concrete pedestal to keep it away from any potential flooding, was a heavy steel lockbox. My mother's spare key, the one I had found in the forgotten envelope, slid into the lock as if it had been waiting for this moment for decades. The lid creaked open. Inside weren't just more property deeds. There were ledgers, dozens of them, meticulously kept in my mother's elegant handwriting. As I flipped through the pages, the real theft finally came into focus. These weren't just records of the apartment building. They were records of C&R Associates, the shell company my father and sister had been using for years. My mother hadn't just been a silent partner, she had been a silent witness. She had documented every cent Charles had skimmed from the family accounts, every loan Rachel had taken and never repaid, and every bribe paid to local inspectors to keep their failing business ventures afloat. But then, I found the final ledger, the one labeled with my name. Inside was a life insurance policy I never knew existed, worth more than the apartment building itself. My mother had set it up 20 years ago, funded by the small dividends from her own inheritance that she had hidden from Charles. It was a trust, locked until I turned 35 or until the family attempted to dissolve the estate. The date on the trust activation was 3 days ago, the day Rachel and Charles broke into my house. By attempting to steal the apartment deed, they had inadvertently triggered a clause that moved every single asset my mother owned into a protected trust for me and Emma, effectively stripping Charles of his remaining family shares. They weren't just desperate for money. They were trying to stop this trust from locking them out forever. Suddenly, a heavy thud sounded from the floor above. I froze, killing my light. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the vents. Someone was in the maintenance room. "I know you're down there, Mary," a voice called out. It wasn't my father. It wasn't Rachel. It was a man's voice, low and textured with a threat that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Your sister owes us a lot of pride, and a lot more cash. She said you had the ledger. She said you'd be the one to make it right." I stayed silent, my back pressed against the cold foundation wall. My mind raced through a trauma assessment. I had no weapon. I had one exit. I was trapped in a 5-foot-deep hole with the evidence that could put my father in prison for life. "Rachel is a liar," I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me yet. The boots moved closer to the hatch. "We saw you leave your house. We know the kid is with a sitter. You're alone. Document. Just hand over the blue folder and whatever else you found in that box, and we can all go home." The black SUV. They hadn't been waiting for Rachel, they had been tracking the inheritance. Rachel hadn't just stolen from me, she had sold me out to her creditors as a way to pay off her own debts. She had told these men that I was the bank, and now they were here to collect. I reached into my pocket and felt my phone. I couldn't call for help, the signal was dead this deep in the concrete. But I remembered the building's layout. There was a secondary ventilation shaft that led to the alleyway, used for the old coal furnace. It was small, tight, and filthy, but it was an exit. I grabbed the ledgers and the life insurance policy, stuffing them into my coat. I heard the hatch creak above me. A sliver of light cut through the darkness of the sub-basement. "Mary, don't make this a surgical procedure," the voice sneered. "I'd hate to ruin those hands of yours." I didn't wait. I scrambled toward the ventilation shaft, my scrubs tearing against the rough stone. I pushed my body into the narrow opening, the smell of soot filling my lungs. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of the man jumping down into the sub-basement. "She's in the vent," he shouted to someone else above. I crawled with a desperation I had only ever seen in the eyes of my patients fighting for their last breath. My shoulders scraped the metal, my fingernails bled as I clawed at the edges of the shaft. I could hear them behind me, the sound of metal groaning under their weight. I burst through the exterior grate into the alleyway, collapsing onto the frozen gravel. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran toward my car, fumbling for my keys. The black SUV was parked at the end of the alley, blocking the main exit. I threw the car into reverse, tires screaming against the asphalt. I slammed into a row of industrial trash cans, creating just enough space to squeeze past. As I sped toward the street, I saw a second man standing by the SUV, holding a phone to his ear. He didn't try to stop me. He just watched. I drove straight to the police station. I didn't care about the speed limits. I didn't care about the red lights. When I burst through the doors, breathless and covered in soot and blood, Detective Harris was standing at the front desk. "Mary?" "What happened?" she asked, her hand moving toward her holster. I pulled the ledgers from my coat and slammed them onto the desk. "My sister didn't just try to steal an inheritance," I gasped, my voice cracking. "She sold my life to cover her debts. And my father has been stealing from this city for 30 years. The next 4 hours were a blur of statements, evidence tags, and phone calls. Kevin arrived, his face pale as he reviewed the ledgers I had recovered. "Mary, do you realize what this is?" Kevin asked, pointing to a series of entries in the back of the second ledger. "These are payoffs. Building inspectors, city contractors. Charles wasn't just skimming. He was running a kickback scheme. Your mother wasn't just documenting a family squabble, she was building a federal case." "I don't care about the city," I said, my voice cold. "I care about the men who followed me. I care about Emma." "We have units at your house," Detective Harris assured me. "And we've flagged the SUV. But Mary, if Rachel told these people you have the money, they isn't going to stop because of a ledger. We need to find your sister. Now." But Rachel was nowhere to be found. She hadn't gone back to her apartment. She hadn't checked in with her lawyer. She had vanished, leaving me to face the monsters she had invited to my door. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Rachel hadn't been arrested the first time because she was a bad thief. She had been arrested because she wanted to be in police custody. She knew those men were coming for her, and she thought the safest place to be was a jail cell, while leaving me on the outside to take the heat. "She used me as a shield," I whispered. "She knew they'd come for the doctor with the deep pockets instead of the sister with nothing left." "We're increasing the guard on Emma," Harris said, her expression grim. "But we need to move you to a safe house." "No," I said, standing up. The surgeon in me took over, the one who didn't run from the trauma. "If they want the money, they're going to have to deal with me. But they're not getting a cent. And neither is my father." I looked at Kevin. "The trust. How fast can we move the assets?" "If the activation clause is met, it's instantaneous," Kevin said. "But Mary, if you do this, you're officially cutting Charles and Rachel off from every penny. They'll have nothing for their defense lawyers, nothing for bail, nothing for the people they owe." "Good," I said. "Let them see what it feels like to have no one left to protect them." As I sat in the interview room, I received a text from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. It was a photo of my front door. Not from a distance, but from the porch. The caption read, "*The ledger isn't enough, document. We want the insurance policy. You have 1 hour to bring it to the old mill, or we tell the police exactly where your sister is hiding. And trust us, she'd rather be in jail than with us. **. I looked at Detective Harris. I didn't show her the text. Not yet. Because I realized that my mother's forgotten envelope had one more secret. I turned to the very last page of the insurance policy, the one I hadn't read in the alley. At the bottom, in tiny, hurried print, there was a list of names. The men who were following me weren't just Rachel's creditors. They were the men my father had been paying off for years. The black SUV wasn't the debt coming due, it was the evidence coming to clean up the witnesses. My sister hadn't just sold me out. She had been caught in a war between our father and the people he had betrayed. And I was the only one left with the keys to the vault. "Detective," I said, my voice steady as a scalpel. "I need you to pull the records for every contractor my father ever worked with. I think I know exactly who is sitting on my porch." The hunt was no longer about a stolen inheritance. It was about a daughter who was done being a victim, a surgeon who knew exactly where to cut, and a family legacy that was about to be burned to the ground. But as I prepared to face the men at the mill, I had one terrifying thought: in a family of thieves, who was actually the one holding the bait? I wasn't the bait. I was the trap. I didn't go to the mill alone. I am a trauma surgeon. I don't walk into a hemorrhaging situation without a plan to stop the bleeding. Detective Harris was in the unmarked car behind me, and Officers Williams and Thompson were already positioned in the rusted rafters of the old building before I even killed the engine. When the men from the black SUV stepped into the light, expecting a terrified woman with a checkbook, they found themselves surrounded by the cold reality of the law. The forgotten envelope was my mother's final surgical strike. Behind the insurance policy, she had hidden a microledger, a detailed map of every offshore account my father, Charles, had used to launder money for the very men now standing in that mill. My mother hadn't just left me an inheritance, she had left me the ammunition to end my father's reign of manipulation. She knew that out of everyone in this family, I was the only one with the steady hands required to use it. The legal fallout was a landslide. With the ledger as evidence, Detective Harris dismantled a decade of Charles's white-collar crimes. Charles was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for money laundering and child endangerment. Rachel, who had gambled her soul on our father's empty promises, was stripped of her real estate aspirations and sentenced to 2 years of house arrest and heavy restitution. Every cent she had stolen from me was ordered to be paid back into a protected trust for Emma. Kevin stood beside me as the final gavel dropped. For the first time in 35 years, the weight on my shoulders didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a shield. I looked at Rachel and Charles as they were led away, and I felt nothing but the clean, antiseptic peace of a successful operation. The rot was gone. I went home to Emma, who was waiting for me on the porch. The Montana air felt different, crisp, open, and finally ours. I realized then that family isn't about the blood you share, but the safety you provide. I had spent years trying to heal a family that wanted to stay broken, but I finally understood that my only true patient was the little girl holding my hand. If you were in my place, would you have stayed silent to protect your father's name, or would you have burned the house down to keep your child safe? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for following my journey. My name is Mary, and this is where the trauma finally ends. All characters and events are fictional and created for entertainment purposes. We hope this story reminds you that your peace is worth more than any inheritance. Thanks for watching.